Aristotle recognized as being the three vital parts of argumentation. Thus, when in 346 Demosthenes made the mistake of getting the libertine Timarchus to prosecute his great political rival Aeschines of misconduct in office, Aeschines countered with a prosecution of Timarchus under the terms of the Dokimasia ton rhetoron, or scrutiny of public speakers. The basis of the charge was that Timarchus was debarred from public life by his private conduct, in that he had prostituted himself as a young man. I expect some of you are studying this then. Aeschines destroys Timarchus' character via an extended narrative of his sexual habits with witness testimony. And just to give you a taste, it doesn't, does it? Maybe me. It keeps me fit walking around, running around. The disingenuousness of the final remark, I say this not to indulge in low gossip, but so you will recognize who he is, reflects a feigned reticence by Aeschines throughout the speech to describe Timarchus' behavior in lurid detail. Aeschines follows this character assassination with an anticipation of the defense arguments that he did not have a shred of solid evidence against Timarchus. Indeed, Chris Carey opines in the introduction to his Texas translation of the speech that it is ultimately no more than a sustained attempt to throw sand in the eyes of the jurors. And that, of course, immediately reminds Dominic Berry and others of us of Cicero in the Pro Cluentio, where Cicero's client, Aulus Cluentius Habitus, was accused in 66 BC by his own mother, Sassia, of poisoning his stepfather, Oppianicus. Cicero did not have to look far for his defense arguments, because the mother's character made them for him. Married 3 times, at one point, Sassia allegedly forced her own daughter to divorce her husband so that she could marry him herself. Cicero destroys Sassia, as he later destroys poor Clodia. Later, according to Quintilian, this is where the throwing the sand in the eyes quote comes from. So that's ethos, character. And since we are on the theme of sexual misconduct, I might as well illustrate pathos, rousing emotions, by giving you another example of the inventive use of sex in advocacy. What's the best way of arousing sympathy for your client if she is a courtesan accused of impiety? Especially if she was the model for the Cnidian Aphrodite. Bring her into court and get her to take her top off. And Jose Frapper sticks more to the ancient story than does Jean-Léon Gérôme in his version, but is less inventive. You can buy a Phryne statue at your local garden centre, like I did. We are supposedly in the post-truth age, but there ain't nothing new under the sun. Further sexual misconduct anon. But for now, we move on to order, taxis, dispositio, arrangement of the speech. or the form of a speech, is the second part of rhetoric and is a tricky topic. A few years ago, Michael de Brouwer wrote a good chapter on the parts of the speech in Ian Worthington's A Companion to Greek Rhetoric. A Greek speech regularly has four main parts: proem, or introduction, narrative, proofs, and epilogue. In discussing the origins of these four parts, de Brouwer notes that authorities can differ as to what counts as a canonically divided speech. Thus, anyone's count is open to argument. That said, I find 24 canonically divided speeches. Among these are several that I would not myself consider to be readily divisible into four parts. Thus, de Brouwer lists 5 speeches of Isaias, numbers 1, 2, 7, 8, and 10. And while speech 1 and the short speech 10 fit the bill, I don't think the same can be said of the others. Speech 2 on the estate of Menocles does indeed start with a proem, narrative, and section of proofs. But after a transitional passage, the speaker moves into a second narrative concerning the quarrel between Menocles and his brother over the sale of their property. The telltale sign for me is the second word in the Greek of section 28, the transitional particle gar. Usually translated for, though it often, as here, does not require translating. My very first Greek teacher, John Breach, told me nearly 50 years ago, "Edwards, when you've mastered the particles, then you will have mastered Greek." I think I'm slowly getting there. The particle gar is regularly found at the start of oratorical narratives. And indeed, that is the case in this speech at the start of the first narrative in section 3. This second narrative is then followed by a second set of proofs and an epilogue. Speech 7 begins with a proem, moves into a narrative at section 5, which is introduced by gar. This narrative concludes in 13 with witness testimony and brief argumentation before a second narrative, also introduced by gar, commences at 14 with further arguments. In my Texas translation of the speech, I then take section 27 to be the start of a third narrative, again the gar, before yet more arguments and an epilogue. The difficulty of classifying the division of many speeches, however, is immediately indicated by the fact that Brenda Griffith-Williams, in her recent commentary on the speech, has the headings Narrative, Testimony, Argument for 5 to 13, Narrative and Testimony 14-17, Narrative, Argument, Laws and Testimony for 18-26, Narrative and Testimony for 27 to 8, before further sections of Argument and Testimony and the epilogue. My 3 narratives become 4, in other words. And finally, in speech 8 on the estate of Chiron, which is arguably Isaiah's best speech, from a rhetorical point of view, a long proem in 1 to 5 is followed by a prothesis at section 6, in which the speaker sets out what he is going to prove, before the first narrative commences in 7 with the regular gar. In my translation, I identified 4 narratives in all indicated by gar, and each followed by a set of proofs. In Griffith-Williams' division, after the proem from 1 to 6 with no prothesis, as in mine, my 4 narratives become 6, all with gar, I notice, and the concluding epilogue. Now, whatever the differences between me and Brenda, and we're good friends, since only 2 of Isaiah's surviving 11 speeches follow the standard model, his method, it is clear, is different. He prefers generally to mix sets of narrative and proof, doubtless because of the complexities of his arguments in these tricky inheritance speeches, so that the jurors do not forget the facts of the case as he presents them. Some other speeches in de Brouwer's list are likewise questionable, notably Lysias 12 against Eratosthenes, which, as Stephen Usher demonstrated many years ago, is effectively complete as a prosecution speech in section 40 out of 100. And much of the rest of those sections is devoted, after an epidictic opening, to attacks on Eratosthenes and Theramenes. Aeschines 1 against Timarchus is closer, but sections 6 to 36 contain a discussion of the laws before the narrative, as Nick Fisher showed in his commentary on the speech. This arrangement recalls the 3 courtroom speeches of Antiphon, none of which moves from proem to narrative, but all have a preliminary argument, usually called a procatusque, between them. It's the relative brevity of de Brau's list that is perhaps telling, less than a quarter of the surviving forensic speeches follow the standard pattern, or alleged standard pattern. And I've suggested before that it may have something to do with the way orators adapt the standard format that leads in part to their inclusion in the so-called canon of the 10 best orators, the, as it were, Premier League of speakers, Demosthenes being Chelsea. This applies even to the regularly slated Andocides, or Tottenham, or you can do your SPL and Celtic and Rangers, or Hearts and Hibs if you prefer. And slated Andocides, who's on the mysteries, is a complex defence against 3 charges. Herodes Atticus, the famous orator of the 2nd century AD, on being accorded the accolade of inclusion among the 10 best orators, supposedly replied, "At least I am better than Andocides." And it was the organisation of Demosthenes 18 on the crown that was a significant contributory factor to its being regarded as the finest Greek speech of all, with a brilliant sandwiching of what may have been difficult legal arguments for Demosthenes to refute. I know Edward Harris doesn't think this, between narratives of his career and invective against Aeschines. Quintilian, following the Ad Herennium, and Cicero in the Orator, called this tactic of sandwiching Homerica dispositio, Homeric order. In the Iliad, the wise Nestor drew up his troops with the cavalry at the front and the best infantry to the rear, and the worst troops in the middle. It's Iliad 4. For Aristotle, a speech only needs 2 parts, a prothesis, or proposition, and a pistis, a proof. Ever the practical philosopher, unlike Plato, he eventually recognizes the need for the 4 parts and discusses them in turn in Book 3 of his great rhetorical manual, The Rhetoric. Roman rhetorical theory, on the other hand, recognized a 6-part divisio, sex partes, into opening narrative partitio, statement of the points at issue, confirmatory proofs, refutatory proofs, variously called confutatio, reprehensio, or refutatio, and peroration. Though, as you can see, Quintilian only has 5 parts, quinque, which, ignoring Cicero, he attributes to most authorities, ut plurimis auctoribus placuit. And he excludes partitio. In essence, Roman theory subdivides the proofs, which are treated as one section in Greek theory, into confirmatory and refutatory proofs. But it's again very interesting that Cicero himself by no means adheres to the standard format. As Berry and Erskine write in their introductory essay to their recent book on form and function in Roman oratory, Cicero's De Imperio Gnei Pompei has a textbook structure, and so Cicero here subjugates function, what he is trying to do, to form, the way he is trying to do it. This will be due, as they argue, to the fact that this speech, delivered in 66, was Cicero's first.